Some cases do not ask how a killing happened. They ask only a single question. Is concealing a truth always a lie, or is it sometimes the last resort of someone trying to protect another? In Houston, a respected surgeon stands accused of covering up a colleague's fatal mistake. But the silence of the operating room concealed a truth far more complicated than anyone in that courtroom expected. The fourth floor of the Harris County Courthouse was unusually crowded that Thursday morning. In the hallways, nurses and resident physicians, still in their hospital scrubs, waited in quiet clusters, all of them there to support the same woman. This was not a murder trial, yet the air in the room felt as heavy as if it were. The woman seated at the defense table was 47 years old, dressed in a dark charcoal blazer, a calm but weary face carrying the marks of 22 years in surgery. Dr. Elena Marsh was chief of general surgery at St. Augustine Memorial Hospital. Her hands lay clasped on the table before her, hands known, across thousands of operations, for never once trembling. On the thumb of her right hand was a thin scar from an operation years earlier, the remnant of a story her colleagues told of hands that never gave up. But today those same hands rested on the table a little more tightly than usual, as though holding something unseen together. In the back rows sat two members of the hospital's board of directors, and beside them the victim's widow, Carol Reyes, a woman dressed in black, clutching a photograph of her husband tightly in one hand. Her silence carried more weight than every whisper in the room combined. Everyone understood that what would be discussed today was not only one doctor's career, but the death of a man. At the very back of the room, 3 local health beat reporters had already opened their laptops. This case was not simply the story of one surgeon, but part of a broader debate across Texas about how hospitals behaved in the aftermath of fatal medical errors. Several healthcare advocacy groups had already announced they would watch the outcome of this trial as a precedent for future transparency laws. When everyone rose, Judge Diane Alvarez ascended the bench, a woman with 18 years of experience, well acquainted with medical malpractice cases. As she opened the file before her, the clerk read the case aloud: The State of Texas versus Dr. Elena Marsh, case number 24CR08841. That name stirred the same question in every mind in the room. At what point does a surgeon's attempt to protect a colleague become a crime? When Assistant District Attorney Renee Castillo rose, her voice carried neither anger nor triumph, only the weight of duty. She read the charges: tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice, the allegation that Dr. Elena Marsh had deliberately altered the records of an operation that resulted in the death of her patient, Daniel Reyes. Your Honor, she said, this case is not about a surgeon's skill, it is about whether the truth was knowingly obscured. Defense attorney Daniel Okafor rose with a clear, resolute voice. Not guilty, Your Honor, he said. My client is a surgeon who has saved thousands of lives over 22 years. That night, she lost a patient while trying to save him, and now, every step she took in the aftermath of that loss is being rewritten as a crime. His words reached every corner of the room. In the back rows, directly behind the prosecution's side, sat the hospital's Director of Administrative Affairs, Richard Coleman, a man in a gray suit whose face betrayed no expression at all. The way he had chosen to sit was the second crack everyone in the room noticed. The hospital was not standing beside its own chief of surgery, but at a careful distance from her. 8 months earlier, on a Friday evening, 52-year-old Daniel Reyes had been admitted to St. Augustine Memorial for what was considered a routine laparoscopic gallbladder surgery. The surgeon performing the operation was not Dr. Marsh, but her colleague of 10 years and former student, Dr. Thomas Hale, 41 years old, known as one of the hospital's most trusted general surgeons. The case rested on 3 pillars: the surgical report documenting that an artery had been accidentally severed during the operation, access logs showing that report had been digitally altered 36 hours after the incident, and the testimony of a surgical nurse present that night who described an unusual hesitation in Dr. Hale's hands. The prosecution alleged these 3 elements together proved a deliberate cover-up. That night, when Reyes's bleeding spiraled out of control, Dr. Hale had urgently called in Dr. Marsh, the most senior surgeon on call. Marsh had worked for 45 minutes trying to stop the bleeding, but Reyes died on the operating table. The death certificate read, "Unexpected vascular injury during surgery." Technically accurate, but, in the eyes of many, a sentence that told only half the truth. But there was something the autopsy had never tested. Dr. Hale himself had not been given a blood test that night, even though hospital protocol called for the operating surgeon to be tested in the event of a fatal complication. Months later, during an internal investigation, that omission was noticed, and investigators began asking why that step had been skipped. St. Augustine Memorial was, at the time, affiliated with one of the largest private hospital chains in Texas, and had already drawn scrutiny from 2 separate malpractice suits over the previous 3 years. Reyes's death occurred only 6 weeks before the hospital's accreditation renewal, a detail of timing that would remain lodged in the minds of many as the trial unfolded. When Marsh took the stand, her voice was calm, the calm of control earned across years in the operating room. Defense attorney Okafor's first question was simple. "Dr. Marsh, can you tell us what happened that night?" Marsh paused for a moment, then began to speak, not with the urgency of self-defense, not with lament, but simply with a surgeon's habit of speaking in facts. She had worked at the hospital for 22 years, trained hundreds of young surgeons, and regularly logged more than 60 hours a week. Dr. Hale had been one of her first residents, a name she had personally trained and trusted a decade earlier. When called that night, she had come without hesitation, running to the operating room without even loosening her tie. Her voice trembled once when she spoke of Reyes's final moments. "I worked to stop the bleeding for 45 minutes, she said. "My hands didn't shake, but something in me already knew we were losing him." The room remained silent for a long moment after that sentence, because it was the voice not of an accusation, but of a loss. Okafor asked, "Then why did you change the language of the death certificate, Dr. Marsh?" For the first time, Marsh turned to face the room as though looking directly into a camera. "I didn't change it," she said. "I only removed one section of the report, a note referring to Dr. Hale's private medical history. I changed nothing about the facts of the surgery itself." Marsh continued, "I met Thomas 10 years ago, when he was still a resident. I trained him, I stood beside him during his first major surgery. I was the first person at the hospital when his daughter was born." When you have known someone that long, announcing their worst moment to the entire world is not easy, especially when you are not certain of it. The room felt the sincerity of that admission, but it also questioned how much that closeness might have compromised her impartiality. When Castillo rose, her voice was neither hostile nor warm, only cautious. "Dr. Marsh, system records show you logged into the hospital database 36 hours after the incident, at 3 in the morning. Why were you working at that hour?" A slight tension crossed Marsh's face. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "No one could sleep that night." Castillo answered sharply. "The medical examiner had not yet requested the official copy of the death certificate, Dr. Marsh. When you made changes to that report, no one had asked you to. Wasn't that a preemptive step, one taken in anticipation of a possible investigation?" Marsh paused for a moment. "I was only correcting the record," she said, her voice slightly weaker this time. That question briefly allowed a small crumb of doubt to sprout again in the room. Was Marsh, in fact, trying to conceal something? Was what she called a correction actually the first step of a cover-up? The audience's conscience, just as it had settled into certainty of her innocence, felt a slight tremor, small but genuine hesitation. Marsh answered from the stand without raising her voice. "I had lost a patient 12 hours earlier, Ms. Castillo. I cannot say every decision I made that night was made with a clear head, but I was not trying to hide something. I was trying to protect someone I believed needed protecting." That sentence shifted the air in the room once again. Castillo pressed further. "And in that moment, Dr. Marsh, did you know exactly who you were protecting, Dr. Hale, the hospital, or yourself?" The question created an unexpected silence in the room. because no one was certain those three possibilities could be separated by so sharp a line. Marsh did not answer for a long moment. When the courtroom door opened, every head turned in the same direction. The woman who entered was Carla Jennings, the surgical nurse present in the operating room that night. 38 years old, with 15 years of surgical experience, a calm but watchful woman. She would be the first to describe what had happened that night. Dr. Hale's hands were different that night than they usually were, Jennings said, her voice steady. There was a slight hesitation, maybe 2 seconds, but for a surgeon that is an eternity. When he severed the artery, for a moment he seemed as though he didn't fully understand what he had done. That statement was the first to bring Dr. Hale's own name under direct scrutiny. Castillo asked, then why hadn't she written that observation into her report that night? Why had she stayed silent until it surfaced 3 months later in an internal investigation? Jennings's answer was brief but heavy, because no one asked. And as a nurse, I know the price of questioning a surgeon's hand. The room felt the weight of the system behind that sentence. The room was no longer listening to a witness. It was listening to a confession about a hospital's silent hierarchy. As she finished, Jennings added, Dr. Marsh tried to protect Dr. Hale that night. But in doing so, perhaps she only did what all of us have done for years. She didn't ask a question she felt she wasn't supposed to ask. The defense called an unexpected additional witness, another of Dr. Hale's former residents, 33-year-old Dr. Priya Anand. When she took the stand, her voice carried exhaustion more than anger. At St. Augustine, 80-hour weeks were ordinary, she said. No one saw it as a problem, because everyone was living through the same thing. Walking into surgery without sleep was treated as a badge of honor among us, not a danger. Anand testified that the hospital had quietly lost 3 different surgeons over the past 5 years to burnout or addiction. None of it made public, none of it the subject of a formal investigation. We survived by protecting each other, she said. But that protection came at a cost, and today Dr. Marsh is the one paying it. For a moment, Castillo seemed to abandon her line of questioning entirely. Why did no one report this before now? She asked, her voice noticeably less formal. Anand's answer was brief. Because the person who reported it would lose their career. The system rewards silence, Miss Castillo, not the person who speaks. The room did not move for a long moment after that sentence. That testimony widened the case beyond the decision of a single woman, toward a culture of silence the institution had sustained for years. The papers on Marsh's table now carried not only her own story, but a truth that had gone unspoken in the halls of St. Augustine Memorial for years. When Richard Coleman was called to the stand, his voice was not that of a surgeon, but of an administrator. Smooth, calculated, rehearsed. The hospital was undergoing a state accreditation review at the time, he said. Any negative press could have jeopardized the hospital's funding and its reputation. That sentence created an unexpected silence in the room. Okafor asked, Mr. Coleman, did you tell Dr. Marsh that this incident needed to be managed? Coleman paused for a moment. I suggested she use language that would protect the hospital's reputation, he said. But I did not order her to alter any records. Okafor pressed on. And what exactly was the difference between that suggestion and an order for a department chief? That question swung the moral compass in the opposite direction for a second time. The woman you had just found suspicious now looked like someone caught beneath the pressure of a system. In the name of protecting the hospital's reputation, Coleman had placed an ambiguous burden on a surgeon's shoulders, and that surgeon had been left to fill that ambiguity with her own conscience. But Coleman's coldness cracked in his own defense as well. When Castillo asked, then why was the blood test skipped, Mr. Coleman? His answer came late. That was not my decision. Then whose decision was it? For the first time, Coleman could not answer directly. Judge Alvarez intervened at this point. Mr. Coleman, this court wants a name, not a defense. After a long silence, Coleman finally answered. Hospital counsel believed the blood test could be used against the hospital in a potential lawsuit. That was their recommendation, not mine. That sentence brought yet another name into the room, but this time not someone seated on the stand, but a law firm remaining behind the scenes. When Marsh was called back to the stand, her voice this time was different, more fragile, but more honest. Dr. Hale had confided in me a year earlier that he was struggling with addiction, she said. Fentanyl, the pressure of the operating room, sleeplessness, prescriptions he wrote for himself. He had gone through rehabilitation, quietly, off the hospital's official records. I was the only person who knew. That confession fundamentally reshaped the room's understanding. What Marsh had removed was not related to the facts of the surgery itself. It was a reference to Dr. Hale's private medical history, information legally protected under patient privacy statutes. But erasing that note had also allowed a possible act of medical negligence that night to remain obscured. Both things were true at once. Castillo asked, "But Dr. Marsh, when you removed that note, did you know Dr. Hale might have been impaired that night?" After a long silence, Marsh answered, "I suspected it, but I wasn't certain, and I didn't want to destroy a man's life over something I wasn't sure of." For a moment, the room tried to imagine the impossible arithmetic Marsh had faced within those 36 hours. On one side, the desire to protect the career and family of a colleague she had known for years. On the other, a family's right to know exactly how the person they loved had died. No medical school had ever taught her how to solve that equation. The room silently weighed the dilemma carried in that answer. Between protecting a colleague's secret and telling a patient's family the truth, Marsh had been forced to make a decision within 36 hours. And that decision now lay on the table, both as a matter of conscience and as an element of a crime. Castillo asked one final question. "And Dr. Marsh, did you ever tell Mr. Reyes's family that a colleague of yours might have played a role in their husband's death?" Marsh's voice was lower this time. "No, I did not. And that, perhaps, was my greatest failure in this case. Not breaking the law, but withholding a truth from a family." The room felt the honesty of that admission, but it also felt its full weight. Just as the room swayed under the weight of that confession, the rear door opened quietly. The woman who entered was Rebecca Hale, Dr. Hale's widow, a tired but resolute woman carrying a faded envelope. Dr. Hale had taken his own life 2 months before the trial began, a fact many in the room did not know. The envelope in Rebecca's hand held a letter her husband had written the night before his death. The defense requested it be submitted to the court. The prosecution objected. Hearsay, they argued. But Judge Alvarez ruled the letter could be considered a dying declaration. The objection was overruled. Rebecca's voice trembled as she read the letter. Her husband's words began to spill slowly into the room. "Don't blame Elena. She tried to protect me, and I tried to protect myself, and we were both wrong. But Daniel Reyes' death was not the result of malice. It was the result of a system. A man working 80 hours a week, unable to sleep, too afraid to ask for help." The room remained silent for a long while after that letter. The audience's conscience staggered for a third time, but this time it could find neither a wholly guilty party nor a wholly innocent one. It could only feel the weight of two people's mistakes, made while trying to protect each other under the pressure of a system. Judge Alvarez did not rush anyone for a while. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentler than it had been throughout the trial. "This court has heard the voice of a dead man today, and that voice has reminded us that no side of this case is a simple story of malice." At those words, Carol Reyes, the victim's widow, turned her eyes toward Marsh for the first time, not with anger, but with a question mark. Castillo projected the relevant section of the Texas Penal Code onto a large screen. Her voice carried the tone of a lesson. The law stated that altering a document that could become the subject of an investigation, even before that investigation formally began, could constitute a crime, so long as the intent was to destroy evidence or conceal the truth. The room fell silent, but the silence came from discomfort, because everyone had grasped, in the same instant, the ambiguity buried beneath the word intent. What had Marsh's intent truly been, protecting a colleague's privacy or burying a truth? Both were possible, and the law drew no clean line between the two. Okafor rose. Your Honor, the law seeks intent, malicious intent. My client chose not to disclose information that could destroy a colleague's life, based on a suspicion she was not certain of. Is that a crime, or is it a flawed but well-intentioned decision made by a human being in an impossible moment? That question would hang over the courtroom for the remainder of the trial. Castillo answered, her voice softer now but her argument still sharp. Good intentions, Your Honor, do not override a family's right to know the truth. Perhaps Dr. Marsh's heart was in the right place, but the law judges the act, not the heart, and the act was altering a record. The room felt that both attorneys were right, and perhaps that was the most honest contradiction of the entire case. In her closing argument, Castillo did not raise her voice. Your Honor, she said, good intentions cannot excuse the concealment of a truth. Daniel Reyes's family had a right to know what happened, and that right was taken from them in the name of protecting a colleague. Okafor lowered his voice as he spoke. This court should not punish a woman for trying to stand firm where a system had already failed. Dr. Marsh was not perfect, but no one was perfect that night. Not her, not Dr. Hale, and not the hospital that drove them both to this point. As Judge Alvarez delivered her instructions to the jury, her voice was even. Good intentions do not erase the elements of a crime, but intent itself lies at the heart of this case. I ask you to weigh the evidence independent of emotion. The jurors left the room with those words, carrying on their shoulders the weight of two competing truths. The jury retired to deliberate. The room was forced to wait for 2 full days, and those 2 days felt as heavy as the trial itself. Throughout those 2 days, Marsh did not go home. She stayed in a small hotel room near the courthouse, kept her phone switched off, and each morning waited alone in the corridor, wearing the same grey blazer. On one occasion, Carla Jennings came to visit her, saying nothing, simply sitting beside her. Some silences are the strongest form of support there is. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, when the jury foreperson rose, every breath in the room stopped at once. On the charge of tampering with evidence, the foreperson said, the jury finds the defendant guilty of a lesser-included offense. The room froze for an instant. On the charge of obstruction of justice, the jury finds the defendant not guilty. Judge Alvarez remained silent for a moment before pronouncing sentence. This court, she said, sees before it not a woman acting in bad faith, but one who made the wrong decision out of an impossible loyalty. I am sentencing Dr. Marsh to supervised probation and community service. I further note that the State Medical Board will suspend her license for 12 months. Marsh closed her eyes as she listened to the ruling. It was not a triumph, but neither was it a collapse. It was simply the price of an impossible night, reduced at last to a number and a sentence. In the courthouse hallway, Carol Reyes and Rebecca Hale stood a few steps apart from one another. 2 widows, each having lost something at opposite ends of the same system. After a long silence, Carol approached Rebecca. Your husband was a victim too, she said, her voice breaking. It took me some time to understand that. Rebecca hesitated for a moment, then took Carol's hand. They exchanged only 2 words, I'm sorry, and I know, a moment that no court ruling could undo, but that could, at last, be given an honest name. At the other end of the hallway, Marsh stood alone, no longer a surgeon, but a woman without a license for the next 12 months. But a group of nurses walked toward her, and silently, without a word, gathered around her. Some loyalties do not end with a court's verdict. Richard Coleman spoke to no reporters as he left the courthouse. The following week, the hospital's board quietly announced his removal, with no press conference, no statement, only a changed name on the institution's website. No one knew for certain whether that decision had come from Coleman's own words in court or from pressure by the accreditation board. Before leaving the courthouse, Carol Reyes turned back one last time and looked at Marsh. My husband admired people who helped others, she said, her voice still fragile. I suppose, in your own way, you are one of those people too. That doesn't mean I forgive you, but maybe I no longer hate you. Marsh said nothing. She only lowered her head slightly. In this case, no one was wholly innocent and no one was wholly guilty. A surgeon tried to protect a colleague. A colleague tried to hide his own collapse. A hospital tried to protect its own reputation. And a family simply wanted to know the truth. A few months later, the State Medical Board issued a new regulation requiring mandatory staff testing after any surgical complication across all hospitals. Some legal commentators had already begun calling it the Reyes regulation, but that regulation did not bring Daniel Reyes back. Nor did it ease the grief of Dr. Hale's family. The system, in this case too, had functioned flawlessly. Evidence gathered, witnesses heard, a ruling delivered. And yet, within that very flawlessness, a family had learnt the truth too late. A woman had lost a year of her career, and the family of a dead man was left alone with a grief no court ruling could ever repair. Perhaps that was the most painful lesson of the entire story. A system can be correct at every step and still leave the outcome feeling wrong. And you who have listened to this story, must now ask your own conscience, when does concealing a truth to protect someone become loyalty, and when does it become a crime? Perhaps the answer lies not in the intent itself, but in the silence that intent leaves behind.